All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I get a chance to talk to someone who's becoming an old friend of mine. We've had a chance to talk over the years in a lot of different situations. We used to be NAMM buddies. We'd see each other at NAMM shows and Music Messa, but a couple years ago we talked to him about sort of his work and his background. This time around, we're going to be talking more about both the development of an album and an instrument. Now, if you haven't already read the title of the podcast, I will tell you we are speaking with Alessandro Cortini. And he has an album that will have just been released when you hear this. It'll have been just released. It's called Scuro Chiaro. And it is a gorgeous album. It combines sort of the sound design and structural elements that I think we are all familiar with from his work, with some really interesting sequencing options and sequencing techniques that we're going to dig into a little bit more. So with no more ado, let's say hello to Alessandro. Hey, man, how are you?
Hello, I'm good. I'm good to be back.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having this chat. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on the new album.
Thank you so much. It's very rewarding to finally have it out.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what led you to create this particular work?
You know, for a lot of my releases, a lot of them were centered on one instrument for a long time, where I sort of. My creativity was sparked by the limitations of the instrument, and that worked very well for a long time. And then I'd say that sort of not kept me, but I never really approached the studio as an ensemble of instruments because I was always very anxious of sort of like having to expand. And so that process was a very get your feet wet sort of process, and it took a while. The first record where I sort of started doing that, where maybe an idea was born on one instrument and then there were other instruments that were sort of like complementing it, was Volume Massimo, which came out 2 years ago. Scuro Chiaro is a continuation of Volume Massimo in the sense that Volume Massimo was born from an array of compositions that I had collected over, I don't even know how many years, in the sense that I don't keep track of when things get done. I just do music every day. I record every day for myself. And then I go back and fish. And these things tend to, like cells, ideas tend to gravitate towards each other. And then they would end up being what you call an album, like they make sense together, like a dish, like a recipe, like a good recipe, like Volume Massimo was that way. It felt like I had a good vintage wine and a good organic steak if you eat meat, but you know what I mean? Like, and then something else from another area of the world, but it doesn't matter when they were made or where they're from, together, they make sense as a great meal. So that's how I sort of I've been approaching records recently. Basically, Scuro Chiaro is born from two tracks that were part of the lineup, let's say, of Volume Massimo, but it just didn't fit. And, I made this example before because of the food, but it's like, you have a nice steak meal and then you have whipped cream to put on top. You're not going to put fucking whipped cream on top of it because it just doesn't work. Right. But that doesn't cut anything from whipped cream in the sense that it's, it has its perks. So the idea was I'd have to create another recipe for those ingredients. And so those tracks were, Lo Specchio, basically two tracks that were released first. So Lo Specchio, Chiaro Scuro. And they were the starting point for the new album. Then basically what happens is that I just collect, ideas from my archives that fit that mood. And it's basically just a discovery as I go. I don't know what's going to end up in it. And it's not a desperate search for things in the sense that, I got to find something that fits. No, it's a very fun, and I really enjoy it because I have to admit that a lot of the things that I listen to that I haven't, that I never listened to that I've made years ago, I don't even remember making because I made them to entertain myself and feel better. I didn't make them with the thought of them becoming a record or so. In a way, they're similar to like raw material, that you might mine for other reasons. You're not thinking about what it will become, because you don't know what it'll become. You know what I mean? And it doesn't matter, because you're truly, extracting joy from just mining it. You know what I mean? That's how the records were born, the last two records.
That makes a lot of sense. One question, though, when you say that, this is part of a daily recording practice that you do for yourself, you also mentioned that this is part of like taking the studio experience. You work on an instrument and kind of expand it with other instruments.
Yeah.
Is that something you did after you chose it to go on? Or is this something that as part of that daily work, you bring all different parts of the studio and you do these fleshed out tracks and the
really
creation
random.
of the album? Oh, okay. Really? It's all over the place.
Random.
Yeah.
Like, for example, there are certain times that one is, just like on the new record on Scuro Chiaro, there are pieces that are one instrument. Like, Corri and Fiamma are synthi tracks, just straight,
really?
Played live, one take. It's one take. There's nothing added. I recorded them, both of them. Actually, Corri was recorded with, a Zoom. So 2 tracks were actually direct in. So the left and right of the synthi, and 2 tracks were done with the built-in microphone of the Zoom. So I could mix and balance the live, quote unquote, sound to the direct, more, fuller sound. And then it was just a matter of making sound as good as possible,
Right.
But it's a live take. That's a live recording. And the same for Fiamma. And then there are things that are a little bit more, they're alive, but they have certain nuances or attachments or add-ons. Like, for example, the track Chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is recorded on an old bucla, what they used to call 151, which actually comes from the San Francisco Conservatory. And it's a 3-rack sort of thing in an old wooden case. It's like an early 70s with a keyboard with its 5-step sequencer. And basically there's a 5-step sequence that plays the main melody and the bass line. And then the keyboard, I just change the root, basically. So the bass line sequence changes, but the bass is changed in 4/4 and the melody is 5. So wherever that melody lands is always different. So it makes it very interesting, And to that, I added guitar later. But yeah, it's never like extremely multi-layer in the sense that I never, probably because of the instruments that I use and how I use them, I feel I get so much emotionally and sonically out of them when you do one take that I never feel like I have to add that much to it. If I'd have to look at the most complex session that I have, either from the new record or the previous record, including, I have 3 sends and returns for effects, which are an AMS RMX 16 reverb, H3000 Eventide as H3000S, and an AMS DMX 1580S delay. So those take up, 3 stereo channels. Right. I think the rest was probably 10 other channels. So it's 5 stereo pairs. So, it's like it's a very compact situation. It's just, these instruments have such a personality that to me, it's very easy to fill up space sonically and by consequence emotionally with them. You know what I mean? So that I don't feel the need to have to add a lot of things nor edit, because I've been doing the live one instrument thing for so long that I got to a point that when I'm pressing record, I'm not demoing anymore. I know that will most likely become something one day. So I'm pretty confident of what I'm recording. It's not just a sketch anymore. You know what I mean?
Sure. The other nice thing about that is that you don't end up picking apart your own work. I certainly know this for myself. One of the worst things I can do is take something and decide that I'm going to produce it, with quote marks on it, because inevitably what I'll do is I'll squeeze all of my enjoyment out of the track too, Yeah,
I agree. And even that, it's not, I'm not here to say that all that is wrong. I think if we approach it in a constructive way, like say, for example, I worked on this and it sounds in a certain way. Let me see if I can make it sound better. So be more of an engineer, mix it and do stuff like that, But if I make a conscious decision of switching from one position to the other, then the creative part is not going to be as influenced or damaged by the following one because I'm already approaching it another way. But it's tough, though, because obviously trying to be a child and making music, in a creative way that makes me feel good, rationality, it's definitely not the first thing that is next to me. It's definitely not my assistant, when I'm making music,
Sure. So one of the things that I really appreciated is that all of the tracks here in this release, all of them kind of feel of a set. So it's kind of interesting to hear that you kind of like pick them from different places. Mm-hmm. They all kind of feel of a set, though. And to me, the things that are kind of the through lines are sort of this dark and heavy pads that kind of, to me, are typical of a lot of your music. Mm-hmm. But also the use of like really simple sequences as kind of a melody, kind of an ostinato, kind of a hypnotizing factor, maybe even to the tracks. And I'm curious, you use a wide variety of systems. What are you doing the sequencing on? Is this something that you use just the little sequencers that happen to be built into the buchla or built into little modular systems, or do you have a more specific sequencing tool that you tend to use? How do you do part sequencing?
When I write, it's usually when the idea comes. When I write, when something comes, usually comes from the direct relationship one-on-one with one instrument. So if that instrument has a sequencer, it's usually the built-in sequencer. Mm-hmm. I have a Sequentix Circlon that I use as a MIDI interface and as a control for the whole studio. But to be honest, I hardly ever use it as a control when it comes to like sequencing the whole studio with it. Occasionally, I might have, not because I don't like it, it's just because if I had machines that didn't have a sequencer, then yes, I probably would use that exclusively, because then you have everything in one place. It's very convenient. Each instrument is controlled by the same set of rules. It would make sense. But I think that sequencing, and especially in Don's instruments, in buchla instruments, and on the Strega and or the zero control, the no control, they're all implemented so differently that the sequencer itself becomes an instrument within the instrument. So the way it behaves within those modules or within that set of elements in an instrument makes it one with the instrument itself. I think it's very important for me to do that. Like, for example, the Synthi, the EMS, the KS of the AKS, the keyboard sequencer. That one is a really cookie sequencer in the sense that, it's basically a memory recorder. It has a certain amount. I think it's 256 steps. You don't hear them. You can just choose the tempo, but you don't hear that tempo. And then you record something, you press play, and it'll play back that phrase. Right. And you can change it. But it's very hard to make something in time. There'll always be something that is either galloping or, there's, and that's the cool thing about it. The sequencer in that case allows you to create voices that are very different from what it would if you would just have a 16-step sequencer that just goes to a clock, Same thing with the MC202 by Roland, It's definitely not the sequencer that I use when I'm thinking I have a sequence in my head and I want to get it down, which hardly ever happens. Right. Yeah. I just do octaves. I literally mash the buttons, mash randomly the octave and the slides. And that's how a record like Risveglio and Sonno came to be. Right. It was the quirkiness of the input method of the instrument that shaped the note output, And I like that because, we talked about this. It's a chess game with the machine. I think the machine really becomes the grammar that I utilize to speak my language, essentially.
Right. Well, it also does kind of throw back to what you said in our previous interview where sort of like working on systems from a developer, it makes sense to you because it makes sense as an instrument. It makes sense as an environment to sort of like embed yourself into, right?
Yeah, exactly. I feel, and I know and I totally respect, people that have much more complex systems where they enjoy adding things and just, going down a path of adding things that have more complex things. I've just never been, arguably some people would look at my systems and think they're are complex as well. But what I'm saying is I usually stop very early in the process when it comes to being satisfied with what I do. It just, I hardly ever come up with a patch that is very intricate. It might be several voices or several parts, but so as a whole, it might be considered an intricate patch. But in general, it's to me, it's very simple.
Right. Now, the other thing that to me is sort of a hallmark of your sound is really creative use of effects and of audio processing. This album, again, sort of like features a heavy and distorted sound on a lot of, particularly on pad sounds. Mm-hmm. Again, something I think that people kind of recognize a little bit as your sound, right? What is the mechanism that you use to do that? Do you have external boxes? Do you use like guitar pedals and stuff to do that? Or do you find ways to overdrive it within the systems? How do you, or do you like overdrive a recorder? How do you get to that sound?
So I've done all three things that you just mentioned at different times. I would think that the overdrive is, I think, for the most part of the instrument. So something like the synthy, for example, each stage can be overdriven. The output of the oscillator into the filter into the amp, the amp into the reverb. All those stages, if you go to 10 with the knob, it's overdriven. So that adds different, kind of vibe to everything. It's not necessarily distorted, but it's definitely saturation. You know what I mean? And so that becomes part of the patch, or part of the sound for me. I haven't really used guitar pedals for distortion as much as I used to. I use a module called, it's made by a company called Overstayer. It's a rack unit, and it's called the modular channel, which is a stereo, mic pre, line processing, compressor, EQ, filter, like Korg MS-20 style, high pass, low pass filter. It's just very creative. It's a very creative box. I use it a lot, both for clean things and for distorted things. Like there's a piece on the Volume Massimo called Sabbia, which is basically just a live performance in the studio that then I processed in real time on that box, basically. But yeah, for the most part, I say the machines that I use tend to have that character. That's sort of like, I'm old, a little, just leave me alone. I'm a little broken.
Right. But the other thing that I'll notice that, and you can tell me where this comes from, is that, so I'm listening to digital copies of stuff, and there's noise floor to your recordings. And it's something that we're not used to now in, like, quote, modern recording. That stuff is like scrubbed out, right? And that seems to be very much a part of what you did as part of the development of the release. Is that some natural part of your recording system, or is that something that you add as kind of glue to work across tracks? Where's that noise floor coming from? Because I'll tell you, a lot of times I'm listening to the digital recordings, and it sounds like I'm listening to a cassette release. It's got that kind of character to it.
So it's definitely a sound that I'm really attached to.
Sure.
You remember the thump of pressing play, and then that sort of like
right. Yes. Yeah,
it's something that will never go away, and I think it's emotionally linked or tied to the way that I enjoy music. Luckily, all the machines that I have already have their own like noise floor, so I hardly ever have the need to inject it. But like in a track like a Chiaro Scuro, there is noise that starts the whole piece basically, which is through a bandpass filter. I think noise is very important as glue, as basically a way to unify everything. It's one of those things that, generally speaking, in a track, you wouldn't realize it's there unless you mute, you mute it and you go, well, something's missing now, And to be honest, I mean, I grew up with noise, obviously, because of the medium that I was using to enjoy music for the most part of my youth. But I guess, CDs were just as, long, but I have to say that part of it was definitely inspired by the work of trance work on the downward spiral, things like that. When I got a chance to take a look at the sessions, there were full tracks of noise that would go through the whole song, but you didn't know that. Like I wouldn't know that listening to the record, but when I look at the tracks, I realized that they were there. You know what I mean? And it was, it was very inspiring because you realize the relationship of noise within sound, and how it is part of it. It's crazy how on one end we're trying, and I do too, because I'm quite an audiophile when it comes to listening to music, so I enjoy devices that allow me to enjoy music at its purest. But when I make it, I am the opposite. So it's kind of it's a weird it's a weird situation.
Yeah, I get it. While at the same time, I mean, being purposeful about your noise floor, again, it's one of those things that becomes kind of a sonic signature too, you know? So I think
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of importance and a lot of value in that. Now, one of the things I think a lot of people will know about you is that you are a pretty adept guitar player as well. But one of the things I would say, this release especially, you mentioned already that there was some guitar work in there. I wouldn't be able to tell you where. I have no idea how guitar fits into this kind of sonic landscape. How do you approach using a guitar in something that is kind of what I would say is a synth record?
Well, I started as a guitar player, and I was really infatuated and inspired by like the metal hard rock shred scene growing up. I was really into fast guitar playing, and to a certain extent, even though I enjoy it, it sort of also prevented me, and this is a personal thing, but prevented me to develop a personal dialogue with the instrument, because you're so inspired by certain musicians that you think that's what you need to be or how you need to play. And I think I took that the wrong way, and it made my development a lot slower. Until I realized the guitar wasn't the main instrument. I wasn't to sound in general, not sound linked to one instrument exclusively. So the last few years, especially since I would say 2017, since I joined Nine Inch Nails, really, but more like in the last few years when I've done more bass and guitar for them live, I sort of rekindled my love with my old guitars and the old idols and the old things. And I've tried to integrate guitar in a way that it's not that, not that there's anything bad, but, I can't be shredding over this. It just doesn't work. It's just not that kind of music.
It's right.
In order for it not to be oil and water, because that's how it feels when it's something that I learned to play in a certain way for so long, is at DNA level. That's what guitar is. And I pick it up, I'm just starting noodling. You know what I mean? And so it's taking a while to make it fit with the quote unquote new me that does, the current me that does electronic music.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's getting there, because I feel like I'm able to make them dialogue in a way where, as you say, sometimes you don't know which one is which, because guitar might become a third voice of a two-voice synth sequence, and but it's recorded and shaped sonically to be part of it. So it's not imitating, but it's in the same realm. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So is affected and processed in a way where it feels like And
It's
a big inspiration
yeah.
for guitar tones in this world was a band called Belong from New Orleans. And their album October Language was, to me, was seminal when it comes to approach and think of guitar in different terms. There's a little bit, well, maybe they would say a lot, but there's a little bit of My Bloody Valentine guitar approach, which is more of a cloud where you can't really hear the picking, and it's more about, an entity which is made by a guitar and it's just moving towards you. And so that was a little bit eye-opening, and helped me to step away from my idea of at the time of guitar playing.
Interesting. That's really interesting, but it also makes perfect sense. And this idea of guitar having the potential of being oil and water and these kind of things, that really resonates with me, because again, I was a guitar player initially too. And it's been very hard for me to find a way to make that fit, because it's so easy to fall into everything I did when I was a guitar player to be like the people that I idolized. And so that makes an awful lot of sense.
Exactly. It's a pitfall, but it's inevitable, because I also don't want to sound like I'm talking trash about guitar. I love guitar, and it's such a unique instrument that it's so natural to come up with that sort of voice on the instrument, So when you're trying to adapt it, I don't think that, electronic music with guitar on top sound good. It's not my thing. I think they're fighting. And also culturally, you're never going to get electronic music people, not that it matters, but to enjoy guitar music, and vice versa. Guitarists are very narrow-minded. I'm sorry to say, but you know what I mean? It's all about the amp, and there's not much, there's pedals, of course, nowadays, but you know what I mean? It's a very, very closed universe.
Well, I'm telling you, when I sort of started getting tired of guitar was actually in kind of the late 80s, early 90s, when what you kind of saw was all the keyboard players were trying to sound like guitar players, and all of the guitar players were trying to sound really robotic like keyboard players. I was like, everyone's lost the picture, you know?
Yeah, but that's sort of like what's happening now with modular, I think, to a certain extent. Like, I mean, I always compare, the current modular scene to the shred scene of the 90s, where, it all started with iconic players like, and one iconic player, Edward Van Halen, it was seminal in the technique and the playing, but let's not forget, wrote hit after hit after hit after hit as a band.
Right.
So yes, he was an incredibly innovative guitar player that inspired tons of people, but he also revolutionized songwriting. Van Halen is undoubtedly one of the biggest U.S. songwriting bands. But what happened is just tons of clones came out. People that, took whatever he was doing and did it faster, did it louder, did it, I mean, I remember seeing guitar magazines where they were selling, picks that would make you pick faster, or things to like, to exercise your fingers to get, like things like, or 8-finger tapping, like, like taking it to an extreme, which was interesting, but also didn't have any of the soul.
Right. Or
the direct dialogue with the listener that Edward Van Halen had. And the same thing is happening now with Eurorack and to me and that sort of world, because we're going from trying to establish a dialogue with a limited set of tools to just going from module to module, just exploiting a little bit here and there. It's just like, there's so many things to keep us interested in that world that at the end of the day, you kind of lose track of what you're doing. Is just a ton of sounds and not much of a common thread between them. You know what I mean? That's my opinion. I might be an old, I am an old man. But what I mean is I do believe that, the amount of tools get in the way of the ability for musicians, no matter what the instrument. In this case, we're talking about synthesizers and modules. It gets in the way of musician to be able to create their own voice, because your own voice comes from learning on an instrument, a limited set of tools. Right. I remember, you would buy something used or whatever because you read something about it in a magazine. You bought it. You did, first of all, you read about it. Or maybe there was an album where you thought that's what they were playing. There were 1,000 videos on YouTube that already kind of sucked the soul out of it. And by the time you get it, you kind of know already what it sounds like. So there's no even like maybe the unboxing is, exciting, but there's not any of that. I remember buying my first microwave, not the Waldorf.
Yeah, right.
Like, I don't think anybody remembers their first microwave
oven, right?
But, and I remember not really knowing what was happening because I kind of have an idea what it was, but, it was such a new thing. There wasn't like, oh, let me check a video, and I'm guilty of the same thing. Like right now I explore a lot of videos, and what happened is it sucks even more is that you get the thing, you open it, play with it a little bit, and then you go back to watching videos about it.
Yeah. Instead of just sitting there and exploring it more. Right.
Yeah. It's almost like we're addicted to this world of snacks where, there's infinite, infinite things, infinite content, but there's never a chance to establish a deeper dialogue and get more nutrition from one single element, like the album, buying a record, the idea of being able to buy something and having it stuck. You bought it with your friends and one bought the cassette, the original. If you put more money, you kept the original cassette and then the others would copy it and make a photocopy of the cover, right? And then you'd listen to it and it was so, but then it was stuck in your car stereo for the whole summer. So if I listen to that now, I remember everything about that summer. Songs bring me back to a certain time, that doesn't exist anymore because you don't have to. There's always something new that you can skip to, whether it's a video on YouTube, whether it's a song on the streaming services, or whether it's an instrument or a module. And I think it's limiting instead of being what people think it is, which is freeing and endless possibility. I think it's very limiting because it avoids and prevents you from tapping your real creativity, your real voice, finding your real voice.
Interesting. So now one of the things that is actually, though, part of this album is maybe the ultimate of like tweaking your way into understanding an instrument, and that's your development of the Strega instrument with Make Noise.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of weeks ago, we talked with Tony, and he talked about his side of the building process. But I'm curious to hear what it was like for you. What was the process? What did the process feel like for you? And what did you feel like you were trying to accomplish in building your own instrument?
I mean, the process was a 3-year-long, incredible relationship. We were friends already, Tony and I, and with Kelly. And so I was part of the Make Noise, clan, and I had been for quite a while. And there was already an affinity, both as friends, and also when it comes to the world of instruments. And on top of it, Tony and I have always improvised with ideas, whether it was something that ended up being an instrument, but it could be anything. Like we would joke and we'd go on. We really like to talk to each other, mm-hmm. which I think is essential for us to be, having been able to do what we did. The concept behind it was that Tony was always interested in how I make music and how I get whatever I get out of specific instruments. So, and to me, obviously, it would have been ideal to create an instrument that was a representation of my sonic aesthetic, and that would allow me to be quicker at creating statements that I felt were more in line with what I feel without having to dig too hard in other machines. And the Strega ended up being that. Now, key to that is a process that really applies to everything. It applies to what I just said about finding your own voice, as a musician and being inspired instead of emulating others. The same thing applied to making an instrument. And the example that I make is something like, if you remember Analog Systems, when they came out with those modules that were they were modules taken from the Synthi. They had the envelope,
right.
The trapezoid,
mm-hmm.
They had the filter, they had the VCOs, and they were interesting because they sort of showed you a look of what those instruments had. But the magic of the Synthi is not the trapezoid, it's not the filter, it's not the oscillator. It's them together within that world. With that specific, the crappy knobs, the built-in speakers, it's the whole. So early on, we understood that it wasn't about, all right, let me take this element from the easel, let me take this element from the Synthi, let me take this element from the Buchla 200 and put them together. So it's a Frankenstein version of the instruments that I like the most. But what is it about the easel that makes me come out with these things, with these ideas? What is it about the Synthi that makes me come out with these sounds? It was extrapolating the reason behind the process more than extrapolating the technical aspect of the machine. So it was a wider research, but also once we understood that was the process, it was a much more successful harvest in the sense that we were able to understand what was happening to me. For example, the Synthi, as I said, one of the main things was overdrive. The overdriving of the stages, which has been implemented. People might not think about it, but on different stages and on the Strega as well. So there's a lot of that is at the core of the Strega sound, and the noise that comes from that specific delay chip that we've used, that sort of like adds that noise whether you like it or not. It's just there. You know what I mean? It took a while. Obviously, it's not like we came out with this design and boom, it was like that 3 years later. There were different iterations, and we did spend a week together in person in Asheville in 2018, where we prototyped and went back and forth. And actually, I just told Tony the other day that I found some, sketches of printouts of what we thought about. And it was just funny to look at those things now and go, wow, I mean,
see what became of them, right? Yeah.
What became of it, But I mean, moral of the story is that I got the prototype, right in the middle of, working on the record. So, or compiling the record. So it was very easy for me to integrate it both as a processing device, because the whole idea behind Strega was, and I say this also on the manual, is that it's to be able to, it's the equivalent of leaving something under the sea for 30 years and then picking it up. Or like if you leave like a spoon or a piece of metal or something, when you find it years later, it's not even about the rust. It's more about the waves have some of the sharp corners now are curves, and there's a patina on it, and it's not necessarily bit reduced or crushed. It's not about that. it's giving a personality and a story to things that might have a different story to begin with. So a simple sequence or a guitar part, all of a sudden are putting on this new suit, this new dress, and I think it's just as good as that as it is at creating sound from scratch, obviously, because it has a built-in oscillator, obviously, that allows you to use it as a source.
Right. Now, the thing is, it was also fitted into kind of the form factor that the no coast and the no control fit into. Was that a natural fit, or did you find that stuff had to be like squeezed or the UI changed? Because to me, an instrument like that, the layout of the knobs is just as important as what's going on with the circuitry, because that's the human machine interaction that's kind of critical. And
that's why we love Buchla instruments.
I was going to say, when you talk about Buchla, you very seldom talk about the circuitry. You almost always talk about how it feels, how you manipulate it, and how it kind of manipulates you.
Does the child care about how the toy was made?
Right. Not so much. Right. No. True.
It only cares about interactivity. And that's exactly what Don was thinking about. And I think Tony does that too. To a certain extent, he thinks first about the way it's going to look, or, how, or early on, to go back to your question, from a complex prototype of wanting to have a touch plate and maybe a sequencer and record your sequences and whatnot, and this and that, we started thinking, hold on a second, this is not just me and you creating something. This is a make noise instrument. It's a collaboration. So why don't we take advantage of what's there already? So we won't need a sequencer. I knew at the time that he was working on we knew that he was working on a no control.
Right.
So we knew that we could count on that form factor for that.
Got it.
So at that point, it made sense. It's like, wait, but then there's no MIDI. Do we want to put MIDI? Well, hold on a second. Well, then if we don't need MIDI and we don't need there'll be another control, then I think it's realistic to expand and have the less stuff laid out in a more natural way, so you don't have to be all tiny with your fingers trying to move stuff and boom, the patch is gone, right? And just take advantage of those features that are already in other parts of this family, this format. So you can also expand if you want to. I mean, I think the Strega is a great standalone system. But, if you can actually come up with something like this and, a little modular surge style case where it has, all three, where you have the zero control, the no control, the Strega, and the no coast. Now, all of a sudden, you have a system with MIDI sequence and an extra oscillator and an extra envelope. It's a much more complex system than it was before. So early on, we started taking advantage of that, way of thinking. And I think it was liberating because it made it easier to feel more satisfied about the standalone factor of the Strega within that environment.
Right.
It would have been silly not to do it that way, to be honest. It just, it made more sense because I also wanted to be battery powered, but then it made more sense to think about a way to power two modules and then have a battery pack if you need to, as opposed to have a battery pack inside the instrument. But I think it's all things that, develop through dialogue. And on one end, you had me, as I said, like a child, just being very excited and coming up with things. And on the other hand, you had someone that has done this for a long time, like Tony, being able to sort of filter what I was saying and telling me we can do this or we can't do that, or we can do this, but this way. I mean, it got frustrating at times, I would think, but I mean, I think it was more him frustrated with sometimes I would say things that were completely out of this world. And I always try to make sure it's like, Tony, I'm sorry if I'm saying this, just I'm so excited, you know what I mean?
That's cool.
But I mean, I can't tell you how much of a different feeling it is to release something like this. Because, I mean, I'm lucky that I have a very strong connection with people that listen to my music, because I know that being instrumental, they're able to sort of, project their own emotional response to it, as opposed to, like, say, a song that has lyrics, which has a content, a more marked subject.
Right.
But now releasing an instrument, it's almost like there's an extra layer, because obviously the instrument is part of me, but to be tagged and seeing all these people on Instagram or YouTube, coming up with their own thing, or like people like Sarah Bell Reed that did a whole EP with it, like she was inspired to write with it. And then, there will be next month an album in July of artists that made music exclusively with the Strega, that integrated in there. It'll be Ben Frost, Caterina Barbieri, Marta Salogni, Irocone, Rob Lowe. Can't remember. There's a lot of it. Mo Espinosa, drum cell. It was a little bit of a problem at the beginning because I'm thinking it's such a personal instrument. I hope it won't be like a meat in a box where people are just going to do whatever and it'll come out with like a 4-note sequence that they won't be able to switch off. It'll go on forever. It's like, Mom. Or something that is too noisy. Because, from the beginning, like pretty early on, Tony looked at me and looked like, you know what? This is a very noisy instrument.
Yeah.
So we kind of early had to decide, are we going through with this or not? Because it was but within the spectrum of what Make Noise was offering, it did make sense because there was nothing that did that. So if someone, rightly so, might say the Strega is too noisy for what I like doing, like, no problem. There's the no-co, so there's modules in their world which are less noisy, let's say it that way. So there was that fear, and I think that couldn't really be planned in the sense that we couldn't really sit down and design something that would sell well. Unless we would have put wooden sides on it, because then that everybody's but this was Grant Richter. I remember Grant at the time when I was designing an instrument that never came out with Tony and Scott Yeager. I was talking to Grant because Grant sold me my first easel. And Grant told me, you know what? If you wanted to sell, just put wooden sides on it. Just make sure you put solid wood sides on it. Because you remember even Don, when released the Buchla 200E, got so many people complain about the fact that he was putting Nordic grade plywood, which, it's strong. Arguably, it's stronger, than normal wood. And lighter, because he thought people are going to tour with this and play shows. They wanted to be a lighter frame. It made sense. There was a reason. It wasn't cheap. It wasn't because it was cheap. But I remember Sound on Sound and others complaining about, it costs $20,000 and it's plywood.
Is it plywood on it, right? Well, it's funny because, I always joke that if you made a plug-in and you wanted to sell it, put wood sides on your plug-in too. Yeah. That seems to be
wood
a
is
thing.
The key, man. Wood is the thing for the synth world. Just put wood.
Apparently so.
There's a Peter Blasser. I don't know if you've ever seen his stuff. The Chiat Lombard stuff, and that's actually all wood.
All wood, right? Exactly.
Yeah, but Peter is one of those individuals to me that follows Don's steps. Like, he's extremely unique in his designs, and it stands on its own. Doesn't look like he cares much about whatever is going on.
Do you use the Fiat Lombard stuff very much?
I've used it. Yeah, I still have some of the stuff. I've used it for a long time. It's sort of like it was a very intense and emotive relationship. So like everything, that intense ends quicker than other things.
Right.
I've used it. There's it's one of the few instruments that they're obviously used in the stuff that I've done with 9 Inch Nails. There's a track called The Eater of Dreams that opens Hesitation Marks, and it's the introduction, and it's done with a plum butter and running trance vocals through a Coco Quantas. So that's all it is. Those 2 instruments, that's it.
That's wild. Well, Alessandro, that our time is up, but this is a fascinating view at both the making of an album and the making of an instrument. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion.
Thank you so much for having me again. Hopefully next time we'll talk in 2 years. The last year would have been just a memory, a distant memory.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan. I like the idea of that. It'd be nice for me to be able to say something like, I caught you while you were on tour. Right now, none of those words make sense, but maybe that's coming back, right?
Yeah, it will. I'm sure it will.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you again.
All right. Thanks again to Alessandro for having the great chat, man. I always enjoy my time talking with him. Super inspiring, actually really has had an impact on me and how I think about my studio and my studio practice. Here's a hint. I picked up one of those Zoom recorders with the built-in recorder or Zoom mixers with a built-in recorder. And I'm recording everything now because going fishing for that old work, that actually sounds like a neat way to approach your body of work. I want to thank you all for continuing to listen. I want to thank you, all of those who supported. I've gotten a number of new Patreon supporters lately. Huge help. Thank you so much. That really helps me stay in the game on getting transcriptions done, which I think is an important historical part of this podcast. I want to thank all of you for continuing to listen. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop me a line, darwin.gross@gmail.com, ddg@cycling74.com, or ddg@20objects.com. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you next time around. Bye.